Okay, let's talk about the spinal cord. And as we do, we'll answer the following questions. What is the relationship between the spinal cord and the vertebral column? And what features are unique to each spinal cord region? So to start, there are 31 total segments of the spinal cord. There's 8 cervical segments, 12 thoracic segments, 5 lumbar segments, 5 sacral segments, and then 1 coccygeal segment. So let's take a look at each of these regions and see how they're unique. Zooming into the cervical region, we see the 8 cervical spinal cord segments, and you'll notice that there are only 7 cervical vertebrae. So what's up with that? The cervical region is the only region that has a discrepancy between the number of vertebrae and the number of spinal cord levels. The occipital bone actually develops like a vertebrae and has similar features to a vertebrae like the foramen magnum compared to the vertebral foramen, for example. And the occipital bone is even sometimes called C0 or C0 as a result. And had it been classified as a cervical vertebrae, then our world would be perfect and we'd have 8 cervical vertebrae and 8 cervical nerves. But unfortunately, it didn't happen that way, so we have 7 vertebrae and 8 nerves. And so you may be saying, Parker, it's just 1 vertebrae, what's the big deal? Well, I'm going to tell you. So spinal nerves in the cervical region exit superior to their associated vertebrae because of this discrepancy. So if we look at, say, like the C3 spinal cord segment, we can then follow out the C3 spinal nerve to where it's exiting the vertebral column, and you'll see that that C3 spinal nerve exits superior to the C3 vertebrae. In all the other regions, like the thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, we'll see the nerves exiting the vertebral column inferior to their associated vertebrae. So when we're talking about the cervical region, just be aware that it's unique and that the nerves are exiting superior to their associated vertebrae. Another unique feature in the cervical region is how the spinal cord swells from C5 to T1. That swelling is called the cervical enlargement. The C5 to T1 spinal cord levels innervate the upper limbs as well as the torso, so the additional neuron cell bodies used to innervate the upper limbs end up causing that enlargement. And that's the cervical region, so let's head inferiorly and check out the thoracic spinal cord. In the thoracic region, there are 12 spinal cord segments and 12 vertebrae, and the spinal nerves exit inferior to their associated vertebral level. So if we look at the T1 spinal cord segment, we can then follow out the T1 spinal nerve, and we see that it exits the vertebral column inferior to the T1 vertebrae. Now take a look at the relationship between the T1 spinal cord segment and the T1 vertebrae, and compare that to the relationship between the T12 spinal cord segment and the T12 vertebrae. How are those different? So if we look, the T1 spinal cord segment is relatively close to the T1 vertebrae, and then as we move inferiorly, we see that the T12 spinal cord segment is a little further away from the T12 vertebrae than was, say, T1. With that in mind, now let's zoom in on the lumbar region. As you look at the L3 and L4 vertebrae, you'll notice that there are no spinal cord levels that far inferior in the vertebral column. The spinal cord actually ends between L1 and L2 vertebrae. That's really important, so I'm going to say it again. The spinal cord ends between the L1 and L2 vertebrae. So why is that? The vertebral column develops at a faster rate than the spinal cord, causing a difference in the length of those two structures. During early stages of development, the spinal cord actually spans the entire length of the vertebral column. Then by the time we're born, the spinal cord's ending around the L3 vertebrae, and then after some more growth and development, the spinal cord finally finds its home ending between the L1 and L2 vertebrae. Despite this difference in length, spinal nerves still exit inferior to their associated vertebrae. The spinal nerves, they're basically just dragged down as the vertebral column develops. So looking at the L5 spinal cord level, we can follow out the spinal nerve roots as they travel down the vertebral canal before finally exiting inferior to the L5 vertebrae. All of the spinal nerves inferior to the end of the spinal cord are known as the cauda equina, or the horse's tail, because cauda or caudal means tail, and equina or equine refers to horse, so it's the horse's tail, and that's what it looks like, and you'll get to see that in lab. In the lumbar region, there's also a lumbar enlargement, and just like the cervical enlargement, the lumbar enlargement is created as a result of having to fit extra neuron cell bodies in the spinal cord to innervate the lower limbs. Now let's take one more trip down and zoom in on the sacral and coccygeal levels. We can see that the nerve roots from the sacral and coccygeal levels are all part of the cauda equina, and at this point there's a lot of distance for those nerve roots to travel to get from the spinal cord to their respective vertebral levels. We can also see that the spinal cord tapers to a point at the sacral and coccygeal levels. This taper looks like a little upside down traffic cone, so we're going to call it the conus medullaris. And that's all the regions of the spinal cord, so let's do a quick recap. We learned there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but 8 cervical spinal cord levels, and as a result of this discrepancy, cervical spinal nerves exit the vertebral column superior to their associated vertebrae. And then in all other regions, so thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal, the spinal nerves exit inferior to their associated vertebral level. We also learned that the spinal cord ends between the L1 and L2 vertebrae, then the nerve roots that fill the rest of the space in the vertebral canal inferior to the end of the spinal cord are called the cauda equina. And that is it for our recap of spinal cord anatomy.